In today's tier list, we are going to be ranking countries from D tier all the way to S tier. To do this, we've identified 11 metrics that make up a successful and functioning country and had Jake the analyst work his witchcraft to come up with a formula for ranking them from best to worst. These metrics are freedom, healthcare, life expectancy, happiness, corruption, environmental performance, gender equality, income equality, GDP, education, and net household income. As no one really cared about our previous methodology sections, we are going to skip over this entirely and let viewers who want to know more check out the link to our stats in the description. All you need to know is that all metrics carry the same weight and that we gathered our stats from 2019 to bypass any COVID-related complications. To work with time constraints, we limited our list to 30 countries, which was mostly based off the watch time for this channel. But with that out of the way, let's get started. The first country on the list is Canada, a nation which scored particularly high in life expectancy, corruption, and happiness. Canada doesn't seem to have any glaring weaknesses when looking at these metrics. However, its average household income seems to be the biggest thing holding it back. With this in mind, Canada still scores itself in A tier. There isn't all that much positive to say about the nation of Mexico. Its health outcomes aren't great, its corruption scores are some of the worst we found, and its household net income is sitting near the bottom of our list. With this being said, its overall GDP isn't terrible, and its citizens seem to be disproportionately happy compared to similar nations. This puts Mexico in the middle of C tier. France comes in around the middle of the pack, which is likely due to some particularly strong contenders. However, this doesn't mean there isn't room for improvement. Income inequality isn't great, happiness could certainly be better, and corruption tends to be higher than many of their European neighbors. With this in mind, for a country whose entire culture seems to revolve around smoking and clashing with the government, French citizens appear to be in quite good hands with their health system. France also scores high in the environment, explaining why it's called the Paris Climate Agreement and not the French Fossil Fuel Fan Club. This, added to its exceptional GDP score, leaves France firmly in B tier. Welcome to the world's most beautiful country that hasn't been relevant on the world stage for almost 100 years. Spain actually has one of the best gender equality and health ratings on our list. However, they're also back of the pack for pretty much every other metric, with income equality being particularly bad. B tier. Next up, we are going to Brazil, a country with some of the worst corruption, freedom, and income inequality on our list. However, when considering the nation's access to healthcare and its impressive GDP, the nation ranks in mid-C tier. There's not much to say about Romania. The nation is generally below average across the board, with particular problems with freedom, education, GDP, and health. As the lowest rated European nation we measured, the country comes out at C tier. It's no secret that South Africa has room for improvement, coming last in life expectancy, equality, and the environment. However, its ability to somehow provide healthcare to every citizen squeezes it just into low C tier. Germany's economy is an absolute powerhouse, coming in at a clear second out of all countries we visited. Unsurprisingly, previously having a long-serving leader with a doctorate in quantum physics has led the country to land the highest education score for today's list, and with the nation scoring well in every other category, it easily earns its A-tier ranking. Thailand is another one of those nations that are just below average at a lot of things, without having any critically low stats, leaving it squarely in C tier. Singapore is without a doubt a very impressive country, coming out number 1 for life expectancy, while also having a dominant score for corruption. Unfortunately, the metrics of environment, income equality, and GDP really hurt the nation in today's rankings, leaving it solidly in the B tier. Singapore's neighbor wasn't so lucky, ranking last in health and extremely low in happiness. With everything else also below average, this leaves the country as our highest nation in D tier. Moving on to Britain's red-headed stepchild, Ireland suffers daily for its abysmal GDP score, although it does make up a lot of ground in education, health, and life expectancy. A very strong showing leaves these lucky lads in A tier. Finland proves itself to be one of the highest rated countries we measured, with the only thing holding it back being a GDP in the bottom 5 for today's list. With this being said, it still scores first place for both happiness and income equality, giving it a very respectable A tier ranking. Hungary generally scores low in pretty much every metric across the board, with its GDP in particular coming in at dead last on our list. With this in mind, it's saved from a lower rank by its net income metric. As one of the lowest rated European nations we measured, Hungary receives a B tier rating. Indonesia's GDP is quite high when compared to a lot of the other nations we examined, but as we'll learn, GDP isn't a very good metric for measuring the success of a country. With abysmal scores for every other metric, Indonesia comes in at the second lowest on today's list, at a solid D tier. Home to one of the greatest Muppets, Sweden absolutely dominates in every single metric, excluding the usual GDP outlier. Truth be told, Sweden is an absolutely stacked country when it comes to pretty much everything, meaning it's able to score a well-deserved spot in S tier. It seems that claiming the title of the invasion capital of the world didn't do any wonders for the nation of Poland, suffering in freedom, happiness, and net income. Although equipped with some serious room for improvement, it was still able to maintain a solid B rating. The Netherlands is generally a high achiever overall, as despite not having a nationwide healthcare service, its life expectancy proves to be exceptional. Despite its GDP being much less of a weakness when compared to its high-ranking counterparts, this still isn't enough to edge it above A tier. For a country shaped like a boot, Italy kicks some serious ass when it comes to healthcare, as it actually comes in at a close second for life expectancy overall. However, on the other foot, the nation takes some serious L's when it comes to both freedom and education. B tier. Belgium is known for its delicious waffles, but not so much for its exceptional equality. Unfortunately, however, its lackluster score in every other metric stops it from hitting the A tier success of its closest neighbors, and it will have to settle for being in the same rank as France. B tier. Long considered by many to be a made-up country for tax purposes, New Zealand boasts one of the best health systems, one of the highest freedom scores, and the least corrupt government on the globe. While New Zealand scores high on most metrics, its modest GDP and income-related stats stop it from achieving the greatness of other comparable nations. If the nation were to foster a thriving tech industry, or happened to find a huge deposit of gold in one of their mountains, they could very likely shoot straight into the #1 spot. Although the nation absolutely dominates in everything that isn't money related, these shortcomings are enough to bump it down to a highest country in B tier. Nestled in between Canada and New Zealand is the United Kingdom, a nation with the second best environmental rank, a solid GDP score, and an exceptional education system. The main metric holding it back was its gender equality, although this wasn't enough to drop it lower than A tier. Kangaroo Land doesn't come first in anything in particular, but it also doesn't seem to have any glaring weaknesses either. Despite being filled with deadly snakes, spiders, and drop bears, Australia has the 4th best life expectancy of today's list, and when combined with its high-ranking education and net income, it joins the A tier club with a strong showing. Australia uniquely wins the title of the highest-rated Commonwealth nation and the highest-rated country in the Southern Hemisphere. Denmark actually scores the silver medal for our ranking today, with its less than stellar life expectancy and GDP bringing it down. However, an interesting trend we found is that none of the top 5 countries on our list scored very well in the GDP metric, leading us to believe they probably don't give a shit if they happen to be dominating in every other category. Denmark is on the S tier council, but we do not grant them the #1 rank. As a regular in our new series, it's hard to know where to begin with Russia. This cold as fuck country ranks dead last in corruption, which isn't surprising when it's pretty much just a dictatorship pretending to be a democracy. Russia also had our lowest score in freedom, meaning you're free to shut the fuck up if you say anything bad about the government. Its only redeeming quality is GDP, which isn't even that high when you consider its enormous population. A very generous C tier. Portugal's healthcare and gender equality ratings are pretty solid for today's offering, but its disappointing GDP score and very low happiness rating cancel out these standout metrics. With this in mind, this puts smaller Spain in a solid B tier position. We now come to the United States, which is a genuinely weird country to say the least. Sitting in at the dead middle of our list, the country was pulled down by healthcare and a pretty insane level of income inequality. With this being said, its GDP is unfathomably massive, actually being larger than the next 8 countries on the list combined. This isn't to say that GDP was the only thing carrying Uncle Sam, as it scored the second place for net household income, and its education rating was up there with some of the best countries we examined. Quite bizarrely, the land of the free actually scored quite low in terms of freedom, especially when compared against other developed countries. The United States shows it has abundant room for improvement. However, the good news is that it seems to have ample money to buy themselves out of its B tier position. Next up is India, which was much worse than we imagined before starting this project. Although it boasts a seriously impressive GDP score, the nation was lost in environment, every kind of equality, and happiness. Unfortunately, this leaves India in D tier and the very bottom of today's ranking. There's unfortunately not a lot of positive things we can say about the Philippines. Every single metric appears to be relatively low, but just not low enough to sink below C tier. With one more country included in our analysis, we decided to leave the best for last, so we'd like to congratulate Norway for winning the top place on our tier list, taking the top spots for both freedom and household net income. If Norway didn't come first place in a category, they likely weren't far behind. The country was miraculously able to place top 10 in everything but GDP, which aligns with the other S tier nations, who also didn't perform well in this metric. Who would have guessed that modern Vikings would end up creating such a functional society? I think around here is where we should state the obvious and say that these were just the 11 metrics that we found most important for a successful country, and there's likely a million other ways to produce a different ranking. On top of this, we won't pretend that this analysis would stand up to peer-reviewed scrutiny, so we are not about to pretend otherwise. Viewers might be wondering why we chose 11 metrics as opposed to a cleaner number. This is because we had initially included crime in our analysis. However, after finishing our first draft, it became clear that including this metric would present some serious problems. What we found was that super high rated countries had some of the highest crime scores on our list, while some of the lowest rated countries appeared to have very little crime at all. When Canada was scoring higher than Mexico, we knew some fuckery was afoot, so we decided to investigate further. What Jake the analyst found is that there was actually a moderate relationship between nations with low corruption also having a high level of crime. As suspected, this likely means that low-scoring countries that tended to have suspiciously good crime scores were likely underreporting for one reason or another, meaning overall crime is very likely much higher than is recorded. With this in mind, we decided to abandon this metric altogether to hopefully generate a more accurate ranking. Another change we made was how we measured GDP, purely because the United States tended to score so unfathomably high. Without normalizing the GDP scores, no other country could hope to come in above a 3 out of 10, and as a result, the United States would jump from the middle of the pack all the way to second place. We made this change not only because we found it skewed the results too dramatically, but also because economists consider GDP to have serious flaws when examining the prosperity of a nation's citizens. As the top 5 countries on our list have some of the smallest GDP ratings, this leads us to believe that our end results were much fairer to our initial premise. Lastly, as you've likely guessed, this list started as an overall ranking before being turned into a tier list to make things more fun. So here's the end scoreboard for people who might be wondering where exactly a country sits in a particular tier. If enough people want a sequel with more countries, we might consider making one at a later date, but until then, links of interest will be in the description. Cheers for watching.